Hey guys, in this video we're going to see if Dendra, the battle studies teacher and best friend of Tulip, has a good or a bad team. Let's get into it. I decided to use Gallade as a UU fighting type since Species Clause limits my ability to use both Tauros. He starts by using the final Gambit, taking out his Veluza and my Hawlucha. I then go into my Medicham and do absolutely nothing to Bronzong over here. I then switch into my Tauros, intimidate him, he sets up the Trick Room, and then goes for a Stealth Rock. I then decide to go for the Raging Bull, but Bronzong's able to hang on. I take some Rocky Helm, he then switches into his Shiny Donphan. I go for another Raging Bull, do a good chunk. I then switch into my Hariyama, take some Rocks damage, take the Earthquake, but barely hang on. He then goes for another Earthquake, takes out my Hariyama. The Trick Room goes away, I then switch into my Medicham, take some Rocks, he switches into his Dragalge. I'm able to go for the Ice Punch and do a huge chunk. He gets some of the Sludge back. He then switches into his Alomomola. I go for another Ice Punch. He eats that right up. He gets some leftovers back. I then decide to switch into my Phalanx, take the Rocks damage. He goes for the Wish, gets a little bit more of his lefties back. He then switches into his Donphan. I go for the No Retreat, trap the Donphan, get the Stop Boost. He gets that Wish health. I then go for the Terra Fighting Close Combat, knock the Donphan down to his Sturdy, lose a little bit of my defense and some health to the Life Orb. He goes for the Earthquake, takes out my Phalanx. I then switch into my Gallade, take some Rocks, he switches into his Dragalge. I go for the Psycho Cut, take him out. He then switches into his Alomomola. I go for another Psycho Cut, thankfully get a lucky crit. He gets some more lefties back, goes for the Protect. My Psycho Cut then completely whiffs, gets that Wish. He's now back at almost full health. I go for another Psycho Cut, do a chunk, but he goes right for another Wish. He then decides to switch into his Goodra. I go for another Psycho Cut, do a huge chunk, but his Wish comes through and he goes right back to full. I then decide to switch into my Medicham. He goes for the Terra Fire, Terra Blast, does a huge chunk, but Medicham hangs on. I go for the Close Combat, do a huge chunk, but Goodra hangs on, takes me out to Terra Blast. I then decide to go into my Tauros, take some Rocks, intimidate the Goodra, go for the Raging Bolt, take him out. He then goes back into his Alomomola. I switch back into my Gallade, take some damage. He goes for the Healing Wish, takes himself out, switches into the Bronzong, fully heals him. I go for the Sacred Sword, do about half, take some Rocky Helm. He goes for the Iron Defense, boosts those defenses, but I'm still Sacred Swording. Take a little bit more damage. He's still going for the Iron Defense, and then he forfeits. Good game. At this time I ask you guys to please like, comment, share, and subscribe as it really helps the channel. And without further ado, let's get into game 2. He starts off with the Salamence, I start off Hariyama. I immediately switch to intimidate him with Tauros. He goes for the Dracometer, almost takes me out. He then decides to switch into his Donphan. I go for the Raging Bolt, do about half. Go for another Raging Bolt, but Donphan hangs on. Goes for the Earthquake, takes out my Bull. I then decide to switch into my Hawlucha. He goes for the Ice Shard, does a nice chunk. I go for the Close Combat, take him out. I get the stat lower, consume my herb, everything comes back, activates my Unburden. He then goes into his Rotom-Mow. I go for the Poison Jab, take him out in one shot. He then goes back into his Salamence, intimidates my Lucha. I decide to switch into my Phalanx. He goes for the Hurricane, completely misses. I then go for the First Impression, do a little bit, take some Life Orb. He goes for the Hurricane, takes out my Phalanx. I then decide to go into my Medicham, go for the Poison Jab, take out the Mence. He then goes into his Palmon. I decide to switch into my Hariyama. He goes for the Double Shock, does a huge chunk, but I hang on. Activate the Citrus Berry, he takes a little bit of damage. He then goes for the Close Combat, cleans up my Hariyama. I then go into my Gallade. He switches into his Tinkatonk, is breaking the mold. I go for the Sacred Sword, do a huge chunk, but he hangs on. Get some lefties back, go for another Sacred Sword, take out the Tinkatonk. He then goes back into his Palmon. I go for the Sacred Sword, take him out. My opponent then forfeits. Good game. Alrighty, let's get into game 3. I start off with my Phalanx, he starts off with the Espeon. I go for the First Impression, take him out on the first turn. Take a little bit of my Life Orb. He then goes into his Dodge Bound. I go for the Poison Jab, do a huge chunk, get the lucky poison, but he's able to hang on. He then decides to set up his Sunny Day, takes some poison damage, and then goes into his Sandy Shocks. He gets that speed boost. I then go for the Poison Jab, which he resists. Thankfully get another poison. Sun is out, he takes some poison. He then goes for the T-Bolt, takes out my Phalanx. Takes a little bit more damage. I then decide to go into my Medicham. He goes for the T-Bolt, Medicham just hangs on. I go for the Close Combat, take out Sandy Shocks. He then decides to go into his Slitherwing, activates that attack boost, goes for the U-turn, takes out my Medicham. He then pivots into his mouse hold. I decide to go into my Tauros, activate the Intimidate. He then goes for the Tidy Up, gets his boost. I go for the Close Combat, take out the mouse hold. He then decides to go into his Armor Rouge. I decide to switch into my Hariyama. He goes for the Calm Mind, starts setting up right in my face. Goes for the Psychic, takes out my Hariyama. He takes a little bit of that Life Orb damage. Sun goes away. I then decide to go into my Gallade, go for the Aqua Cutter, take out the Armor Rouge. He then decides to go back into the Slitherwing. I decide to switch into my Tauros, get that Intimidate. He goes for the U-turn, does nothing to my Bull. He then goes into his Dodge Bound, takes a little bit of poison damage. I then make a terrible misplay, go for the Raging Bull, activate his Well-Baked Body. I then decide to switch into my Hawlucha. He goes for the Wish, takes a little bit more poison damage, goes for the Protect. I go for the Close Combat, he gets protected. He gets Wish Comes True, gets a big chunk back. I then go for the Poison Jab, doing a little bit to him. He goes for the Yawn, makes my Hawlucha drowsy. Takes a little bit more poison damage. I then go for the Poison Jab and take him out. My Hawlucha then decides to catch up on some Beauty Sleep. He goes into his Slitherwing, gets that boost. I go back into my Paldean Tauros, intimidate him. He goes for the Terra Flying, dual Wing Beat, does a huge chunk but Tauros hangs on. Sun is still going strong, goes for another dual Wing Beat but misses. I go for the Wild Charge and take him out. My Tauros then goes down to Recoil. Good game. Alrighty, and that's the video. Please let me know what you guys think about the team down below and stay tuned for more future content. Peace!